So right now, somewhere underneath the ocean, there's a beam of light carrying your voice, or someone's voice, or maybe a video of someone's cat, through a glass fiber no thicker than a human hair. That light is bouncing along the inside of that fiber at, well, the speed of light, traveling from one continent to another in the time it takes you to blink. And here's what gets me. There are over 1 million kilometers of these cables down there, resting on the ocean floor, draped across underwater mountains, buried in the mud of continental shelves, connecting every part of the world to every other part, and most people have no idea they exist. That's kind of the beautiful thing about the internet. It works so well, so invisibly, that you almost never think about what's actually happening when you tap a link or send a message. It just goes. But underneath that effortless surface is one of the most intricate engineering systems humanity has ever built, and the story of how it came together. How we went from a world where sending a message across a country took days on horseback to a world where you can video call someone on the other side of the planet in real time. That story is genuinely one of the great adventures of modern engineering, and tonight we're going to walk through it. All of it. Slowly. There's no rush. Let's start way before the internet existed. Let's start with the problem. For most of human history, information could only travel as fast as a person could carry it. Think about that. If you wanted to tell someone something and they were 100 miles away, that message was traveling at the speed of a horse, or a runner, or a ship. Maybe 4 miles an hour on foot, maybe 10 on a good horse. That was it. That was the speed limit of human knowledge for thousands of years. Empires rose and fell, and the whole time, the fastest way to send a message was to hand it to someone and say, "Ride." There were clever workarounds, of course. The ancient Greeks used fire beacons. You'd light a fire on a hilltop, and someone on the next hilltop would see it and light theirs, and so on down the chain. You could send a simple signal like, "The enemy is coming," across a surprising distance in just a few minutes. But the bandwidth, to borrow a term we'll come back to later, was terrible. One bit of information. Fire or no fire, yes or no. You couldn't send a poem by bonfire. You couldn't send a contract or a love letter or a weather report. The French, in the 1790s, actually built something remarkable, the Chappie telegraph. Claude Chappe and his brothers designed a system of wooden semaphore towers, each one with big, movable arms on top that could be arranged into different positions. An operator at one tower would look through a telescope at the tower before them, read the position of the arms, and then set their own arms to match, passing the message along to the next tower. By 1794, they had a line of these towers stretching from Paris to Lille, about 230 kilometers, and a message could travel that distance in roughly 30 minutes. Napoleon loved it. He used it to coordinate military operations. At its peak, France had over 500 of these towers. But here's the thing. It only worked during the day and only in clear weather. Fog, rain, nightfall, and the whole network went dark. Plus, you needed a person at every single tower, watching, waiting, relaying. It was expensive. It was fragile. And it was still, fundamentally, a visual system. Light traveling from one human eye to another, limited by line of sight and the curve of the earth. The real revolution, the one that would eventually, through a long and winding chain of inventions, lead to the internet, started with electricity. And it started with a question that seems almost childishly simple. Can you send a signal through a wire? The answer, it turned out, was yes. And the person who made it practical, not the only person working on it, but the one whose name stuck, was Samuel Morse. Now, Morse is an interesting character because he wasn't an engineer or a scientist. He was a painter. A genuinely accomplished portrait painter, actually. He'd studied at the Royal Academy in London. He'd painted portraits of presidents. But in 1825, while he was in Washington working on a commission, his wife fell ill back home in Connecticut. A letter was sent to him, but by the time it arrived, by the time he got home, his wife had already died and been buried. He hadn't even known she was sick. That grief, that specific, personal experience of information arriving too late, drove Morse to spend the next decade working on a way to send messages instantly over long distances using electricity. He wasn't the first to try. There were earlier attempts in Europe, some of them quite clever. But Morse, working with his colleague Alfred Vail, came up with something elegant: a code, dots and dashes, short pulses and long pulses of electric current, each combination representing a letter, the famous Morse code, and the system they built to send and receive those pulses, the telegraph, was simple enough to be practical and reliable enough to actually work. In 1844, Morse sent his famous first message over a telegraph line strung between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, "What hath God wrought?" And that moment, that specific moment, is worth pausing on because it represents a fundamental break in the history of human communication. For the first time ever, a message traveled faster than any person or animal could carry it. The message moved at essentially the speed of electricity through a copper wire, which is a significant fraction of the speed of light. Information had been decoupled from physical transportation. That had never happened before in the entire history of civilization, and the world went absolutely wild for it. Within a decade, telegraph lines were spreading across the United States and Europe like nervous systems growing through a body. By 1850, there were over 12,000 miles of telegraph wire in the United States alone. Businesses used it. Governments used it. Newspapers used it. The Associated Press was basically founded to share the cost of telegraph transmissions. The stock market was transformed because prices could be communicated in minutes instead of days. But there was a problem, and it was a big one. The telegraph worked great over land, where you could string wire between poles. But what about oceans? The Atlantic Ocean sat between the two great economic powers of the 19th century, the United States and Great Britain, and messages between them still had to travel by ship, 10 days minimum. In an age when information within each country was now moving at the speed of light, that 10-day ocean gap was maddening. So people started thinking about putting a telegraph cable under the ocean. And this is where the story gets genuinely wild, because the first transatlantic cable is one of the great engineering sagas of the 19th century. The driving force behind it was Cyrus Field, an American businessman who had made a fortune in the paper industry and retired at 33. He was wealthy, restless, and ambitious, and when he heard about the idea of a transatlantic telegraph cable, he threw himself into it with everything he had. The challenges were staggering. The Atlantic Ocean between Ireland and Newfoundland is roughly 2,500 miles wide, and in places it's over 2 miles deep. Nobody had ever laid a cable anywhere near that long or that deep. The cable itself had to be engineered from scratch. A copper conductor at the core, insulated with gutta percha, which is a natural rubber-like material from Southeast Asian trees, then wrapped in iron wire for strength and protection. The whole thing had to be flexible enough to unspool from a ship, but strong enough not to snap under its own weight as it sank to the ocean floor. Field organized multiple attempts. The first serious try was in 1857. They loaded the cable onto a ship, the HMS Agamemnon, and started laying it from the Irish coast. After about 300 miles, the cable snapped. Gone. Sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic. They tried again in 1858, this time using two ships that would meet in the middle of the ocean, splice the cable together, and then sail in opposite directions, one toward Ireland, one toward Newfoundland. After multiple failures, storms that nearly sank the ships, and cables that broke again and again, they finally got a connection in August of 1858. Queen Victoria sent a message to President James Buchanan. It took over 17 hours to transmit because the signal was so weak, but it worked. The cable worked. There were parades. There were fireworks. Cyrus Field was a national hero. And then, 3 weeks later, the cable died. The insulation failed. The signal faded to nothing. Some historians believe that the chief, electrician, Wildman Whitehouse, and yes, that was really his name, damaged the cable by pushing too much voltage through it, trying to boost the weak signal. He was using induction coils that sent massive jolts of electricity into the cable, and the delicate gutta-percha insulation couldn't take it. Others argue the cable was flawed from the start, that the manufacturing process had introduced defects. Either way, it was dead. Millions of dollars, years of effort, and it lasted 3 weeks. Field didn't give up, but the American Civil War intervened, and it wasn't until 1865 that another attempt was made, this time using the Great Eastern, the largest ship in the world at the time. That attempt also failed. The cable snapped about 600 miles from Newfoundland. But in 1866, they tried again with the Great Eastern, and this time, finally, they succeeded. The cable was laid, the signal was strong and clear, and it stayed working. They even went back and fished up the broken 1865 cable from the ocean floor, spliced it, and completed that one too. So by the end of 1866, there were 2 working transatlantic telegraph cables. Now here's why this matters for our story about the Internet. That 1866 cable established a principle that still governs how the Internet works today. The global network runs on undersea cables. Right now, in this moment, roughly 97% of intercontinental Internet traffic travels through fiber-optic cables on the ocean floor. Not satellites, cables. The technology has changed. Copper and gutta-percha have given way to glass fibers and laser light. But the basic idea, the audacious concept of connecting continents by running a line under the ocean that goes straight back to Cyrus Field and the Great Eastern. And the telegraph did something else that matters enormously for understanding the Internet. It introduced the idea of a network. Not just a single point-to-point connection, but a web of connections linking many places to many other places. By the 1870s, telegraph networks covered most of the industrialized world. There were switching offices where messages could be routed from one line to another, operators who would receive a message on one wire and retransmit it on a different wire heading in the right direction. It was manual. It was slow by our standards, but the architecture, the fundamental concept of a network of nodes that routes messages from origin to destination, that's the skeleton that everything else would be built on. The telephone came next, of course. Alexander Graham Bell, 1876, and that's a whole fascinating story in itself. The patent race between Bell and Elisha Gray. The controversy over who actually invented what. The fact that Bell's original telephone was barely functional, and it took years of refinement before it was commercially viable. But for our purposes, the telephone did something the telegraph couldn't. It carried the human voice. Analog sound waves, converted into electrical signals and back again. And that meant the network had to get a lot more sophisticated, because voice requires a continuous connection for the duration of a conversation, not just a burst of dots and dashes. This led to the development of circuit switching, and this concept is really important, so let's sit with it for a moment. When you made a telephone call in, say, 1950, what happened was that a dedicated electrical circuit was established between your phone and the phone you were calling. Physical switches in telephone exchanges would close, one after another, creating an unbroken copper path from your handset through potentially dozens of switching offices all the way to the other person's handset. That circuit was yours for the duration of the call. Nobody else could use those wires while you were talking. When you hung up, the switches opened, and the circuit was released for someone else. This worked. It worked really well, actually, for voice calls, but it had a fundamental limitation that would become a very big problem as people started thinking about connecting computers to each other. And that problem was efficiency. Or really, the lack of it. Think about what happens during a phone call. You're talking, sure, but you're also pausing. You're thinking. You're listening to the other person. You're saying, uh-huh, and right. And there are these long stretches of silence where nothing is happening on the line at all. Some studies later estimated that in a typical voice conversation, the circuit is actually carrying useful information maybe 40% of the time. The rest is silence. But that dedicated copper path, it's still yours, still locked up, still unavailable to anyone else. For voice, that's an acceptable trade-off, because when you do speak, you need that connection to be there instantly. No delay, no waiting. But computers don't communicate like people. Computers communicate in bursts. A computer might need to send a big chunk of data, a file, a calculation result, a message, and then sit there doing nothing for minutes or even hours before it needs to send the next thing. If you tied up an entire circuit-switched connection between two computers, you'd be wasting almost all of that capacity almost all of the time. It would be like renting an entire highway just so you could drive one car across it once a day. And here's the thing. In the early 1960s, this wasn't just a theoretical concern. People were actually starting to think seriously about connecting computers together, and the economics of circuit switching for that purpose were just absurd. A dedicated long-distance telephone circuit between, say, a computer at MIT and a computer at a research lab in California would cost a fortune per month, and it would sit idle almost the entire time. There had to be a better way. Now, the person who first articulated this problem clearly and proposed a solution was a researcher you've probably never heard of, and that's kind of a shame because his idea is one of the most important in the entire history of computing. His name was Paul Baran, and he worked at the Rand Corporation, which was this Cold War think tank in Santa Monica, California. Rand did a lot of work for the U.S. military, and Baran's particular concern in the early 1960s wasn't actually about efficiency at all. It was about survival. See, this was the height of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened in 1962. The very real possibility of nuclear war was on everyone's mind, and one of the military's biggest vulnerabilities was its communications network. The telephone system was hierarchical. It had these major switching centers, regional hubs, and if you knocked out a handful of those central nodes with nuclear strikes, the entire network would collapse. You'd have military commanders unable to talk to each other, unable to coordinate a response, and that kind of communication failure could actually make nuclear war more likely, not less, because if a country can't communicate with its own forces, It might launch everything preemptively out of fear that it won't be able to later. So Buran was asked to think about how to build a communications network that could survive a nuclear attack. And what he came up with, published in a series of 11 volumes for RAND starting in 1964, was remarkable. First, he said, you need a distributed network, not a centralized one with a few critical hubs, but a mesh where every node is connected to several other nodes, so that if any individual node gets destroyed, messages can just route around the damage. Think of it like a fishing net versus a spider web. A spider web has that one critical center point. Damage that, and the whole thing falls apart. A fishing net, you can cut holes in it all over the place, and it still holds together because every knot is connected to several other knots. But here's where Buran's real breakthrough came. He proposed that messages shouldn't be sent as continuous streams over dedicated circuits. Instead, they should be broken up into small, standardized pieces. He called them message blocks, and each piece should be sent independently through the network. Each block would carry the address of its destination, and at every node along the way, the network would figure out the best available path to send that block toward its destination. Different blocks from the same message might take completely different routes. They might arrive out of order. And that would be fine, because the receiving computer would reassemble them. This is packet switching. This is the idea that makes the internet possible. And I want you to really appreciate how radical this was in 1964, because it went against everything the telephone industry believed. The telephone companies had spent decades building circuit-switched networks. They had massive infrastructure investments, armies of engineers who understood circuit switching inside and out. And here was this guy at a think tank saying, actually, your whole approach is wrong for this new kind of communication. When Buran briefed AT&T on his ideas, they essentially told him he didn't know what he was talking about. One AT&T engineer reportedly said that Buran didn't understand how networks worked, which is kind of ironic given how things turned out. Now, here's what's wild. At almost exactly the same time, completely independently, a British computer scientist named Donald Davies at the National Physical Laboratory in London came up with essentially the same idea. Davies was approaching it from a different angle. He wasn't thinking about nuclear survivability. He was thinking about how to build an efficient network for interactive computing. But he arrived at the same fundamental concept. Break messages into small pieces. Send them independently. Reassemble at the destination. And it was actually Davies who coined the term packet. Buran called them message blocks, but Davies's word is the one that stuck. Two people on opposite sides of the Atlantic with different motivations, independently inventing the same revolutionary idea. That happens more often in the history of technology than you might think, and it usually means the idea's time has come. The underlying conditions are ripe and the solution is almost inevitable. So now we have the concept, packet switching. But concepts don't build networks. Somebody has to actually build the thing. And that brings us to one of the most important and misunderstood projects in the history of technology, ARPANET. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, was created in 1958 as a direct response to Sputnik. The Soviet Union had launched the first artificial satellite. America was in a panic about falling behind technologically, and ARPA was set up within the Department of Defense to fund cutting-edge research that might have military applications. But ARPA had a particular genius in its organizational structure. It gave a lot of autonomy to its program managers, and it funded academic researchers with relatively few strings attached. The culture was, find brilliant people, give them money, and get out of their way. In 1962, a psychologist and computer scientist named J.C.R. Licklider took over ARPA's Information Processing Techniques office, and Licklider had a vision that was almost science fiction for the time. He wrote a series of memos about what he called the intergalactic computer network. And yes, he actually used that phrase, partly as a joke, but partly because he genuinely believed in the transformative potential of connected computing. Licklider imagined a future where people could access any computer from any terminal, share data and programs across institutions, collaborate in real time. He didn't have the technical details worked out, but he had the vision, and more importantly, he had the funding authority to start making it happen. Licklider moved on from ARPA after a couple of years, but the vision persisted through his successors, Ivan Sutherland, and then Bob Taylor. And it was Bob Taylor who really pushed the ARPANET project forward. Taylor's frustration was very practical. In his office at the Pentagon, he had 3 different computer terminals connected to 3 different remote computers at 3 different research institutions, and each terminal had its own login procedure, its own commands, its own quirks. He wanted one terminal that could connect to any computer. That's it. That was the spark. Not nuclear survivability, not some grand military strategy. Just a guy annoyed that he needed 3 terminals on his desk. Taylor got the funding approved in 1966. The story goes that it took him about 20 minutes to convince ARPA's director, Charles Hertzfeld, to allocate $1 million. 20 minutes for $1 million. That kind of thing could happen at ARPA. Then Taylor recruited a young computer scientist named Larry Roberts from MIT's Lincoln Laboratory to actually run the project. Roberts was initially reluctant. He had a good thing going at MIT. But ARPA had leverage because it funded a lot of Lincoln Labs work, and Roberts eventually agreed to come to Washington. Roberts is the person who turned the ARPANET from a vague vision into an actual engineering plan. He designed the network topology, figured out the technical requirements, and made a crucial decision. The network would use packet switching. Roberts had read Baran's Rand papers, and he'd met Donald Davies at a conference in 1967, and he was convinced that packet switching was the right approach. But here's the clever part of Roberts's design. He realized that you couldn't ask each university's computer to handle all the networking tasks itself. These were expensive research computers running all kinds of different software, and their owners didn't want to dedicate processing power to network management. So Roberts and his team came up with the idea of a separate, dedicated computer at each site that would handle all the networking, receiving packets, routing them, checking for errors, managing connections. They called these machines Interface Message Processors, or IMPs. Each site would have an IMP, and the IMPs would talk to each other, forming the network backbone. The host computers at each site would just need to know how to talk to their local IMP, and the IMP would handle everything else. The contract to build the IMPs went to a small Cambridge, Massachusetts company called Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, BBN. And this is one of those moments where you realize how much of technological history comes down to relatively small groups of very talented people just figuring things out as they go. BBN's team, led by Frank Hart, had to design and build hardware and software for a kind of computer networking that had never been done before. They were working under a tight deadline. The first IMP was supposed to be delivered to UCLA by September 1969. They used ruggedized Honeywell DDP-516 mini-computers as the hardware base, and then wrote the routing and packet handling software from scratch. And on the other end, at the university sites, a group of graduate students were trying to figure out how the host computers should actually communicate with each other through the IMPs. This group, working mostly at UCLA under the guidance of a grad student named Steve Crocker, started writing what they called requests for comments, RFCs. And this is one of those small decisions that ended up having enormous consequences. Crocker was nervous about seeming presumptuous. These were just graduate students after all, and they were essentially defining the protocols for a major government-funded network. So he deliberately made the documents informal and open, calling them requests for comments to signal that these weren't authoritative specifications handed down from on high, but rather proposals open to discussion and improvement. That spirit of openness, of collaborative development, of rough consensus. It became embedded in the culture of Internet standards development, and it persists to this day. The RFC system is still how Internet standards are published. RFC 1 was written by Steve Crocker on April 7, 1969, and as of now, there are over 9,000 of them. So, September 1969 arrives, and the first IMP is delivered to UCLA, where Leonard Kleinrock's team is waiting for it. Kleinrock, by the way, had done important early theoretical work on packet switching in his doctoral thesis at MIT in 1962, another thread in this tapestry. The second IMP went to the Stanford Research Institute, where Doug Engelbart's team was based. And Engelbart is the guy who invented the computer mouse and gave that legendary demonstration in 1968 that showed hypertext and video, conferencing, and collaborative editing, all decades before any of that became common. On October 29, 1969, Charlie Klein, a UCLA student programmer, attempted to send the first message over ARPANET from UCLA to SRI. He was trying to type the word login. He typed the L, he typed the O, and then the system crashed. So the first message ever sent over what would become the internet was low, which, if you think about it, is kind of perfect. Low, as in, lo and behold. They got it working properly about an hour later and successfully sent the full word. But that moment, that crashed, incomplete two-letter message, that's the beginning. By December 1969, 4 nodes were connected. UCLA, Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. 4 computers talking to each other across hundreds of miles using packet switching. And almost immediately, people started using it in ways the designers hadn't fully anticipated. Email, for instance. That wasn't part of the original plan. The ARPANET was supposed to be about sharing computing resources, letting researchers at one university use the expensive computers at another. But what people actually wanted to do, it turned out, was talk to each other. Ray Tomlinson, at BBN, wrote the first network email program in 1971, and he's the one who chose the @ symbol to separate the username from the computer name. A small decision, he later said he chose, partly because it was unlikely to appear in anyone's name. But now that symbol is one of the most recognized characters on Earth. And here's where things start to get really interesting, because ARPANET worked. But it was just one network. It was a closed system connecting a specific set of research institutions. At the same time, other people were building other networks, AlohaNet in Hawaii, which used radio instead of telephone lines and pioneered some really clever ideas about how multiple devices can share a single communication channel. There was Cyclades in France, designed by Louis Pouzin, which introduced some concepts that would turn out to be critically important. There were commercial networks starting to appear. And the question that started to emerge was, how do you connect these different networks to each other? Because each one used its own protocols, its own packet formats, its own rules. Getting a computer on ARPANET to talk to a computer on AlohaNet was like trying to have a conversation between someone speaking French and someone speaking Japanese. The underlying intent might be the same, but the languages were completely incompatible. This is the problem that two people in particular set out to solve, and their solution is arguably the single most important technical achievement in the entire history of the Internet. Their names were Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, and what they created was a protocol called TCP/IP. And that name might sound dry, might sound like just another acronym in a field, absolutely drowning in acronyms, but TCP/IP is the reason the Internet exists. Full stop. Everything you do online, every email, every video call, every time you tap a link or stream a song, runs on the foundation these two guys laid down in the early 1970s. So let's talk about who they were. Vint Cerf is one of those people who just radiates curiosity. He'd been a graduate student at UCLA, actually present during that first ARPANET message from UCLA to SRI in 1969. He was part of Steve Crocker's group, the ones writing those early RFCs, figuring out protocols on the fly. So he'd been there from the very beginning, watching this network grow from 4 nodes to dozens, seeing what worked and what didn't. Bob Kahn came from a different angle. He'd worked at BBN, the same company that built the IMPs, and then moved to ARPA itself, where he was thinking about the bigger picture. Kahn had been involved in a really important demonstration in October 1972 at the International Computer Communication Conference in Washington, D.C., where ARPANET was shown off publicly for the first time. They set up a working node right there in the hotel, let attendees sit down and actually use the network, connect to computers across the country. It was a huge moment. People who'd only heard about packet switching in theory suddenly saw it working in real time. And it was during this period that Kahn started thinking seriously about the internet working problem. Not just making one network better, but connecting fundamentally different networks together. Here's the thing about why this was so hard. It wasn't just a translation problem, though translation was part of it. Each network had been designed with different assumptions. ARPANET used dedicated leased telephone lines, which were relatively reliable. AlohaNet used radio, which was noisy and lossy. Packets got corrupted or lost all the time. A satellite network, which the military was experimenting with, had enormous delays because signals had to travel all the way up to a satellite in orbit and back down again. The packet sizes were different. The addressing schemes were different. The error handling strategies were different. And the original ARPANET design had a particular architectural choice baked in. The network itself was responsible for making sure packets arrived correctly. The IMPs, those refrigerator-sized boxes at each node, would check every packet, request retransmissions if something went wrong, and guarantee reliable delivery. The intelligence was in the network. Now, Louis Pouzin over in France with Cyclades had taken a different approach, and this is where his contribution becomes really important to the story. Pouzin argued that the network should be dumb, not dumb in a bad way, dumb in an elegant way. The network's job, he said, should be to move packets from point A to point B as fast as possible. And that's it. Don't check for errors in the middle. Don't guarantee delivery. Don't try to be clever. Just shove the packets along. If something goes wrong, if a packet gets lost or corrupted, let the computers at the endpoints deal with it. let the sending and receiving machines handle reliability. This idea, which Pouzin called a datagram approach, was radical at the time. A lot of people thought it was irresponsible. You're just going to throw packets into the network and hope for the best. But Pouzin's insight was that this made the network itself much simpler, much faster, and much easier to build. And it meant you could connect very different kinds of networks together because you weren't asking each one to guarantee the same level of service. You were just asking each one to do its best to move packets forward. Cerf and Kahn took this idea and ran with it. Cerf has been very open about how much Cyclades influenced their thinking. And the architecture they came up with, which they published in a landmark paper in May 1974, a Protocol for Packet Network Intercommunication in IEEE Transactions on Communications, split the problem into two layers. This is the TCP/IP split, though at first it was all one protocol called TCP, and the separation came a bit later. But the core idea was this. One layer, which became IP, Internet Protocol, would handle addressing and routing. Its only job was to take a packet, look at the destination address, and figure out how to get it one step closer to where it needed to go. That's it. IP doesn't care what's in the packet. It doesn't care if the packet arrives. It doesn't guarantee order. It's beautifully, deliberately simple. And the other layer, TCP, Transmission Control Protocol, would sit on top of IP, running on the endpoint computers, and handle all the hard stuff. TCP would break a message into packets, number them so they could be reassembled in order, keep track of which ones had been acknowledged by the receiver, and resend any that got lost. Think about what this separation means. It's like the difference between the Postal Service and you personally keeping track of your correspondence. The Postal Service, that's IP, just moves envelopes. It doesn't know or care what's inside. It doesn't guarantee delivery, technically. It just does its best to route each envelope to the right address. But you, the person sending and receiving letters, that's TCP. You keep track of what you've sent. You notice if you don't get a reply. You resend if needed. You number your pages so the recipient can put a long letter back in order, even if the pages arrive scrambled. The beauty is that the Postal Service can use trucks, planes, boats, bicycles. It doesn't matter, as long as the envelope gets there. And that's exactly the point. IP can run over any kind of network: Ethernet, radio, satellite, telephone lines, fiber optics, carrier pigeons. There's actually an RFC about that, RFC 1149, a standard for the transmission of IP, datagrams on avian carriers, which was written as a joke in 1990 but has actually been implemented. The point is that IP is agnostic about the physical medium. It just needs to move packets. And this is the key architectural decision that made the Internet possible. By pushing intelligence to the edges, to the endpoint computers, and keeping the network itself simple, Cerf and Kahn created a system that could grow without anyone's permission. You didn't need to redesign the whole network to add a new type of connection. You just needed to make that new connection speak IP, and suddenly it was part of the Internet. This is sometimes called the end-to-end principle, and it was articulated most clearly in a 1981 paper by Jerome Salzer, David Reed, and David Clark at MIT. But the seeds of it were right there in what Cerf and Kahn were doing in the mid-70s. Now, getting from that 1974 paper to a working system took years. The original TCP specification went through multiple versions. There were heated debates. One of the biggest was the decision to split TCP into two protocols, TCP and IP, which happened around 1978. Some people wanted to keep them together. Cerf and Kahn realized that not every application needed TCP's reliability guarantees. Sometimes you just wanted to fire off a packet and not worry about whether it arrived. For things like real-time voice or video, where a retransmitted packet arriving late is worse than a lost packet. So they separated the reliable delivery part into TCP and created a simpler alternative called UDP, User Datagram Protocol, which basically just adds port numbers to IP and says, good luck. UDP is what makes things like live video streaming and online gaming work today because it prioritizes speed over perfection. A few dropped frames in a video call? You barely notice. But if the system paused to retransmit every lost packet, the delay would be unbearable. So by the late 70s, you had this TCP/IP architecture taking shape. But ARPANET was still running on its original protocols, NCP, the Network Control Protocol. Getting the entire network to switch over was a massive undertaking, and the date it happened is worth remembering. January 1st, 1983. That's the day ARPANET officially cut over from NCP to TCP/IP. It's sometimes called Flag Day because there was no gradual transition. On that day, every node had to switch, and if your system wasn't ready, you were simply off the network. The transition had been planned for years. John Postel, who was basically the quiet, meticulous conscience of the early internet, he edited the RFC series. He managed the address and protocol number assignments. He was the kind of person every large technical project desperately needs. Postel had sent around a message that essentially said, "The deadline is real. We are not extending it. Get your systems ready." And it worked. There were hiccups, of course, but the transition happened. And from that day forward, TCP/IP was the language of the network. But here's what's really interesting about this period. The internet, as we know it, this vast, open, global thing, didn't just emerge from the technology. It emerged from a set of decisions about governance and access that could easily have gone differently. ARPANET was a military-funded project. It could have stayed classified, stayed restricted. The protocols could have been proprietary. Instead, the RFCs were open. The specifications were free. Anyone could implement TCP/IP without paying a license fee. And in the early 1980s, a decision was made that would have enormous consequences. DARPA funded the implementation of TCP/IP in the Berkeley software distribution of Unix, BSD Unix, which was widely used in universities. This meant that any university running BSD Unix suddenly had TCP/IP networking built right into their operating system, essentially for free. And universities, being universities, started connecting to each other. This is also the period when the domain name system came into being, and it solved a problem that might seem trivial, but was actually becoming urgent. In the early days, every computer on the network had a numeric address, an IP address, a string of numbers like 128.32.0.12. And there was a single file, maintained by a single person, Elizabeth Feinler, at the Stanford Research Institute's Network Information Center, that mapped those numbers to human-readable names. It was literally a text file called hosts.txt, and every computer on the network had to periodically download a fresh copy. When the network had a few hundred hosts, this was manageable. But the network was growing fast, and the system was breaking down. The file was getting huge. Updates were constant. Conflicts over names were increasing. It was like trying to run a phone book for an entire city by having one person write it by hand. Paul Makapetris at USC proposed the solution in 1983, described in RFC 882 and RFC 883. The Domain Name System, DNS, was a distributed, hierarchical database that could translate human-friendly names into IP addresses without requiring a single central file. The way it works is genuinely elegant, and it's something your devices do hundreds of times a day without you ever thinking about it. When you type a web address, say something like example.com, your computer doesn't actually know where that is. It needs to find the IP address. So it asks a DNS resolver, usually run by your internet service provider. That resolver might have the answer cached from a recent query. If not, it starts a process of asking a series of authoritative servers, starting from the root. There are root servers that know which servers are responsible for .com, which ones handle .org, .uk, and so on. The .com server knows which specific server is authoritative for example .com, and that server finally provides the actual IP address. This whole chain of queries usually takes milliseconds. You never notice it happening. And what makes DNS so clever is that it's distributed. No single server has to know everything. Each level of the hierarchy only needs to know about the level below it. You can add new domains, new servers, new entire top-level categories without redesigning the system. It scales beautifully. And it has to, because today, there are hundreds of millions of domain names registered worldwide. So by the mid-1980s, you had TCP/IP as the universal language, DNS translating names to addresses, and a growing constellation of university and research networks connecting to each other. ARPANET itself was actually becoming less important. It was being overtaken by the network of networks it had spawned. In 1986, the National Science Foundation created NSFNET, a backbone network connecting 5 supercomputer centers across the United States, and this became the new high-speed spine of the growing internet. The initial NSFNet backbone ran at 56 kilobits per second, the same speed as a single ARPANET line, but it was quickly upgraded to 1.5 megabits per second, and then to 45 megabits per second by 1991. And NSFNET had an acceptable use policy that was both its strength and its limitation. It was for research and education only. No commercial traffic allowed. That restriction would eventually become one of the most important policy battles in internet history, but for now, through the late 80s, the internet was still essentially an academic playground, a growing one, an increasingly indispensable one, but still a world of universities and research labs. And it was in this world that something happened which most people today would barely recognize as the internet at all, but which was, for millions of early users, their first taste of what networked communication could feel like. Before the web, before browsers, before anything looked the way you're used to, there was a system called Usenet, and there were tools like Gopher, and there was a culture forming, a strange, passionate, sometimes contentious culture of people who were discovering what it meant to be connected. And the story of how that culture collided with a young physicist's idea at a European research lab is one of the most consequential stories in the history of technology. And it starts in a place you might not expect. The Swiss-French border, deep underground, where physicists were smashing particles together at nearly the speed of light. CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, is one of those places where the density of brilliant people per square meter is just absurd. Thousands of physicists, engineers, and computer scientists from dozens of countries, all working on experiments so large and complex that no single institution could manage them alone. And in 1989, one of those people was a British physicist named Tim Berners-Lee, who had a problem. Not a physics problem, an information problem. CERN was drowning in documents, research papers, technical manuals, phone directories, project notes, experimental data, all scattered across different computers running different operating systems, stored in different formats, accessible through different protocols. If you wanted to find something, you had to know which computer it was on, how to connect to that computer, and what software to use once you got there. It was a mess, and people were constantly arriving and leaving. CERN had a huge turnover of visiting researchers, which meant institutional knowledge was always walking out the door. So Berners-Lee wrote a proposal. He submitted it to his boss, Mike Sendall, in March of 1989, and the title was simply Information Management, a Proposal. And Sendall's famous response, scrawled on the cover page, was vague but exciting, which might be the most consequential piece of marginalia ever written, because what Berners-Lee was proposing was, essentially, the World Wide Web. Now here's what's important to understand. The internet already existed. TCP/IP was running, DNS was working, email was flowing, Usenet was thriving, Gopher was letting people browse menus of documents on remote servers. What Berners-Lee invented was not the internet. What he invented was a way of organizing and linking information on top of the internet that turned out to be so intuitive, so flexible, and so powerful that it became the thing most people think of when they hear the word internet. And the core idea was almost embarrassingly simple. Hypertext, text that contains links to other text. The concept wasn't new. A visionary named Ted Nelson had coined the term back in 1963, and before him, Vannevar Bush had imagined something similar in his famous 1945 essay, As We May Think, where he described a hypothetical device called the Memex that would let you follow associative trails through a vast library of microfilm documents. The idea of linked information had been floating around for decades. What Berners-Lee did was make it work, practically, on a global network, using a set of technologies so elegant in their simplicity that they could be implemented on almost any computer. He created three things. First, HTML, hypertext markup language, a simple way to format documents and embed links in them. You didn't need to be a programmer to write HTML. It was just text with some angle brackets around certain words to indicate structure. This is a heading. This is a paragraph. This is a link to another document. Second, HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, the rules for how a browser asks a server for a document and how the server sends it back. It's a conversation, really. The browser says, "Give me this document," and the server says, "Here it is." And that's basically it. Third, URLs, Uniform Resource Locators, a standardized way of addressing any document on any server anywhere in the world. A URL is just an address. It tells you the protocol to use, the server to connect to, and the path to the specific document you want. Put those three things together, and you have a system where any document anywhere can link to any other document anywhere, and anyone with a browser can follow those links. That's the web. That's the whole thing. Berners-Lee built the first web server on a Next computer at CERN, one of those sleek black cubes that Steve Jobs designed after he was pushed out of Apple, and he wrote the first web browser, which he called World Wide Web, one word, capital W's. And on December 20th, 1990, he put up the first website. It was just a page explaining what the World Wide Web was and how to use it. Nothing fancy. No images, no colors, just text and links. But think about what that meant. For the first time, you could sit at your computer, click a word, and be reading a document stored on a machine in another country. And from that document, you could click another link and jump to yet another machine. The information was connected not by physical wires, though of course it traveled over wires, but by meaning, by relevance, by the author's decision that this idea over here relates to that idea over there. And here's what Berners-Lee did that was arguably even more important than the technical invention itself. He gave it away. He didn't patent it. He didn't charge licensing fees. He convinced CERN to release the web protocols and code into the public domain in April of 1993, making them free for anyone to use, modify, and build upon. Think about that decision for a second. If the web had been proprietary, if you'd needed a license to run a web server or build a browser, the entire history of the internet would be different. It might have ended up like one of those walled garden services, CompuServe or Prodigy or AOL, where one company controlled the experience. Instead, Berners-Lee chose openness, and that choice is one of the reasons the web exploded the way it did. But the explosion didn't happen immediately. For the first couple of years, the web was mostly a tool for physicists and computer scientists. The early browsers were text-only, and using them required a certain comfort with command lines and technical details. What changed everything was a kid at the University of Illinois. Mark Andreessen was an undergraduate working at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA, in Champaign-Urbana, and in early 1993, he and a programmer named Eric Bina created a browser called Mosaic. And Mosaic did something that seems obvious in retrospect, but was genuinely revolutionary at the time. It displayed images in line with text. Before Mosaic, if a web page referenced an image, you had to click a link and open it in a separate window. Mosaic put the pictures right there on the page, alongside the words. It also had a clean, intuitive graphical interface that ran on regular, personal computers, Windows machines, Macs, Unix workstations. You didn't need to be a computer scientist to use it. You just pointed and clicked. Mosaic was released in various versions throughout 1993, and the effect was dramatic. Web traffic on the NSFNET backbone grew by something like 341,000% that year. That's not a typo. The web went from a niche tool to a cultural phenomenon in months. And Andreessen, who graduated and moved to California, teamed up with Jim Clark, the founder of Silicon Graphics, to start a company called Netscape Communications. Their product, Netscape Navigator, launched in late 1994, and it was Mosaic's ideas refined, polished, and turbocharged. Navigator was fast, it was free for personal use, and it became the gateway to the web for millions of people. By 1995, Netscape had something like 80% of the browser market. And this is where the story of the internet collides with the story of money. Because remember that NSFNET, acceptable use policy, no commercial traffic? Well, by the early 90s, the pressure to open the internet to commercial use was becoming irresistible. Businesses could see what was happening. They could see the potential. And the argument for keeping commerce off the internet was getting harder to sustain as the network grew beyond its academic roots. In 1991, the Commercial Internet Exchange was established, allowing commercial networks to interconnect. The NSF began transitioning the backbone to commercial providers, and on April 30th, 1995, NSFNET was officially decommissioned. The backbone of the internet was handed over to a collection of commercial telecommunications companies, Sprint, MCI, UUNET, and others, who operated their own backbone networks and connected to each other at peering points. This was a profound shift. The Internet went from being a government and university project, funded by taxpayers and guided by research priorities, to being a commercial infrastructure, driven by market forces and business models. And the speed of what happened next is genuinely staggering. In January 1993, there were maybe 50 websites in the world. By June 1995, there were over 23,000. By 2000, there were over 10 million. People were registering domain names like prospectors, staking claims in a gold rush, because that's essentially what it was. But here's the thing about all of this explosive growth. Underneath the web pages and the browsers and the .com frenzy, the actual plumbing of the Internet, the physical infrastructure that carried all those packets, was undergoing its own quiet revolution. And to understand that revolution, you need to understand something about light. Specifically, about what happens when you take a glass fiber thinner than a human hair and shoot a laser down the center of it. What comes out the other end is, in a very real sense, the foundation of the modern Internet. Because without fiber optics, none of this, none of the streaming, the video calls, the billions of web pages loading every second, none of it works. Not at the scale we're used to, not even close. So let's talk about light in glass for a minute, because the physics here is genuinely beautiful. The basic idea is something called total internal reflection. You probably played with this as a kid without knowing it. If you've ever looked up from the bottom of a swimming pool and noticed that the surface looks like a mirror at certain angles, you've seen total internal reflection. Light traveling through a denser medium, like water or glass, hits the boundary with a less dense medium, like air, and if it hits at a shallow enough angle, it doesn't pass through. It bounces back, all of it. No light escapes. And if you can create a long, thin strand of very pure glass, and you shoot light into one end at the right angle, that light will bounce its way down the entire length of the fiber, ricocheting off the walls, thousands and thousands of times, traveling enormous distances with remarkably little loss. Now, people had understood total internal reflection for a long time. The physics goes back to the 1840s and experiments by Daniel Colladon and others who showed that light could be guided along curved paths through water streams. But turning this into a practical communication technology, that took over a century of work. The big problem was always loss. Early glass fibers absorbed and scattered so much light that after just a few meters, your signal was basically gone, useless for communication. In 1966, Charles Cow and George Hockham at Standard Telecommunication Laboratories in England published a paper arguing that the loss in optical fibers wasn't a fundamental limit of glass itself. It was caused by impurities. If you could make glass pure enough, they calculated, you could transmit light over kilometers, not meters. Cow essentially said, the glass we have is dirty, but the physics says clean glass should work beautifully. He was right, and he won the Nobel Prize in Physics for it in 2009, which was well-deserved, and honestly a little overdue. The breakthrough in actually making that ultra-pure glass came in 1970, when a team at Corning Glass Works, Robert Maurer, Donald Keck, and Peter Schultz, created a fiber with a loss of about 20 decibels per kilometer. That might not sound impressive stated that way, but it was below the magic threshold that Cow had identified as necessary for practical telecommunications. And the improvements came fast after that. By the mid-70s, losses were down to a few decibels per kilometer. By the 80s, they were approaching the theoretical minimum for silica glass, around 0.2 decibels per kilometer at a wavelength of 1,550 nanometers. That's infrared light, by the way. You can't see it with your eyes, but it's the color that travels through glass fiber with the least resistance. Here's what's clever about how this translates into internet infrastructure. A single optical fiber can carry an enormous amount of data because you're not limited to sending just one beam of light. You can send multiple beams simultaneously, each at a slightly different wavelength, a slightly different color of infrared light, and they'll all travel through the same fiber without interfering with each other. This technique is called wavelength division multiplexing, or WDM, and it effectively turns one fiber into dozens or even hundreds of independent communication channels. Think of it like a highway where cars of different colors can magically pass through each other. Each color carries its own stream of data, and at the receiving end, you separate them back out with filters. The capacity is staggering. A single fiber pair, one fiber sending, one receiving, using modern dense wavelength division multiplexing, can carry terabits per second. Terabits. That's trillions of ones and zeros every second. Through a thread of glass you could barely see. And this is what lies beneath the internet's explosive growth in the 90s and beyond. While everyone was marveling at web pages and email and the dot-com boom, telecommunications companies were laying millions of miles of fiber-optic cable, under streets, along railroad rights-of-way, through conduits and ducts, and, most dramatically, under the oceans. Because here's the thing about a global internet. It has to be, well, global, and that means crossing oceans. The first transatlantic fiber-optic cable, TAT8, went into service in 1988, connecting the United States to the United Kingdom and France. It could carry about 280 megabits per second, which was a huge leap over the old copper submarine cables. But the cables that followed made TAT8 look quaint. By the late 90s, cables like FLAG, the fiber-optic link around the globe, were stretching from England to Japan, over 28,000 kilometers of cable laid along the ocean floor. And laying these cables is itself an incredible engineering story. You've got specialized ships, cable-laying vessels, that carry thousands of kilometers of cable on enormous spools. The cable has to be armored to protect it from anchors, fishing trawls, sharks. Yes, sharks. They bite the cables, possibly attracted by the electromagnetic fields from the repeaters, earthquakes, and the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. In shallow waters near the coast, the cable is buried in trenches plowed into the seabed. In the deep ocean, it just sits on the bottom, 3 or 4 kilometers down, in the cold and the dark. And every 60 to 100 kilometers along the cable, there's an optical amplifier, a device that boosts the light signal without converting it to electricity and back. These amplifiers use a beautiful piece of physics, a short section of fiber doped with erbium, a rare earth element. When you pump energy into the erbium-doped fiber with a separate laser, it amplifies the optical signal directly. It's like giving the light a little energy boost so it can keep going. And these amplifiers have to work for 25 years on the ocean floor without maintenance, because you really don't want to send a ship out to haul up cable from 3,000 meters deep to fix a broken repeater. Today, there are over 500 submarine cable systems crisscrossing the world's oceans, carrying roughly 99% of intercontinental data traffic. Not satellites, cables. That surprises a lot of people. We tend to imagine the internet as something wireless, something floating in the cloud, something ethereal. But it's not. It's glass and light and armored cable sitting on the ocean floor, and it's one of the great engineering achievements of the modern world, even though almost nobody thinks about it. So that's the physical layer, the plumbing. But let's zoom back up to what was happening on top of that plumbing in the mid to late 90s, because this is where the internet goes from being a fascinating technology story to being a world-changing economic and cultural phenomenon. And it starts, as so many things do, with competition. Remember Marc Andreessen and Netscape? Navigator launched in late 1994 and quickly dominated the browser market. By mid-1995, Netscape had something like 80% market share. They were the gateway to the web for most people, and they knew it. Netscape went public on August 9, 1995, in one of the most dramatic IPOs in history. The stock was originally planned to be offered at $14 a share, but demand was so intense they doubled it to $28. On the first day of trading, it opened at $71 and closed at $58. The company was valued at nearly $3 billion. It had existed for about 16 months. Jim Clark, who had co-founded the company with Andreessen, became a billionaire. Andreessen, 24 years old, was on the cover of Time magazine, barefoot, sitting in a golden throne. The message was clear. The internet was where the money was, and Microsoft noticed. Bill Gates had been somewhat slow to recognize the importance of the internet. There's a famous internal memo from May 1995 called The Internet Tidal Wave, where he essentially told everyone at Microsoft to pivot hard toward the internet. And when Microsoft pivoted, it pivoted hard. They developed Internet Explorer, bundled it free with Windows, and launched what became known as the browser wars. This wasn't a polite competition. Microsoft leveraged its dominance in operating systems to push Internet Explorer onto every desktop in the world. By 1998, Internet Explorer had overtaken Netscape in market share. Netscape was eventually sold to AOL in 1999 for about $4 billion, but the product itself faded. It was a brutal lesson in how platform power works. You could invent the future, but if someone controlled the operating system that everyone used, they could take your market away. But the browser wars, for all their corporate drama, actually accelerated the web's development. Both Netscape and Microsoft were racing to add features. JavaScript, which Netscape's Brendan Eich famously created in about 10 days in May 1995, gave web pages the ability to be interactive and dynamic. Cascading style sheets, or CSS, separated the visual design of a page from its content, and both browsers pushed the boundaries of what HTML could do, sometimes in incompatible ways that drove web developers absolutely crazy, but always pushing forward. And underneath all of this, the protocols that made the internet work were continuing to evolve. One of the most important developments of this era was something most people never think about but use every single day: the development of secure communication on the internet. Because here's the problem. When you send a packet across the internet, it passes through many different networks, many different routers, and at any point along the way, someone could potentially read it. That's fine for loading a web page about cats. It's not fine for sending your credit card number to an online store. And if you can't send credit card numbers safely, you can't have e-commerce. And if you can't have e-commerce, the commercial internet doesn't really work. The solution came from cryptography, and specifically from a protocol called SSL, Secure Sockets Layer, developed at Netscape by a team led by Taher El-Gamal. SSL and its successor TLS, which stands for Transport Layer Security, use a beautiful combination of two types of encryption. The first is public key cryptography, which solves a problem that had bedeviled secret communication for centuries. How do two parties who've never met agree on a secret key without someone eavesdropping on the exchange? The answer, worked out in the 1970s by Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman, and independently by Ralph Merkle, and then made practical by Ron Revest, Adi Shamir, and Leonard Adelman with the RSA algorithm, is that you can have a pair of keys, one public, one private, where anything encrypted with the public key can only be decrypted with the private key. So a website can publish its public key for all the world to see, and when your browser wants to communicate securely, it uses that public key to encrypt a session key that only the website can decrypt. After that initial handshake, both sides switch to faster symmetric encryption using that shared session key. It happens in milliseconds, every time you see that little padlock icon in your browser, and it's what made the commercial internet possible. Now I want to take you somewhere that might seem like a detour, but trust me, it connects. Because around this same time, the mid to late 90s, something was happening that would fundamentally reshape not just the internet, but the global economy. And it starts with a question that sounds simple, but turns out to be incredibly deep. When you type a web address into your browser and hit enter, how does your request actually find its way to the right server, possibly on the other side of the planet? And how does the response find its way back to you? We talked about DNS earlier, and we talked about IP addresses and routing. But the actual mechanics of how routing works at a global scale, how the internet figures out the best path for your packets through this vast, constantly changing maze of networks, that's a story unto itself. And the protocol at the heart of it is called BGP, the Border Gateway Protocol. And it is simultaneously one of the most important and most terrifying pieces of infrastructure holding the modern internet together. Because BGP is the protocol that lets all the different networks that make up the internet, your home, ISP, a corporate network in Tokyo, a cloud data center in Virginia, an academic network in Sao Paulo, figure out how to pass traffic between each other. And the wild thing about BGP is that it's built almost entirely on trust. Let me explain what I mean. Think back to the basic architecture we've been talking about. The internet isn't one network. It never was. It's a network of networks, thousands and thousands of them, each one called an autonomous system. Your ISP is one autonomous system. Google runs another. Amazon runs several. A university might operate its own. Each one has an AS number, just a unique identifier, and each one manages its own internal routing however it likes. But when traffic needs to cross from one autonomous system to another, that's where BGP comes in. It's the language these networks use to talk to each other at their borders, hence the name Border Gateway Protocol. Here's how it works roughly. Each autonomous system uses BGP to announce to its neighbors which blocks of IP addresses it can reach. So your ISP might announce, hey, I can reach this range of addresses. And its neighbor hears that and thinks, okay, if I get traffic destined for that range, I'll send it to this ISP. That neighbor then announces to its own neighbors, I can reach that range too, through this ISP, which is one hop away. And so the announcements ripple outward across the internet, hop by hop, until every network has a map. Not a complete map, but a set of possible paths to every reachable block of addresses on the planet. When your packet needs to get from your laptop in, say, Chicago, to a server in Amsterdam, your ISP's routers look at their BGP routing table and pick the best available path. Best meaning shortest in terms of AS hops, or preferred based on business relationships, or sometimes just the path that the network operator has manually configured as preferred. The packet gets handed from one autonomous system to the next, like a relay race, each one checking its own routing table and making its own forwarding decision until the packet arrives. And this all happens in milliseconds. Hundreds of thousands of BGP routers around the world, each maintaining tables with over 900,000 route entries as of recent years, all cooperating to move your data. It's genuinely remarkable. But here's the thing that makes network engineers lose sleep. BGP has no built-in way to verify that an announcement is true. When an autonomous system says, "I can reach this block of addresses," the rest of the internet basically just believes it. There's no cryptographic proof, no central authority checking the claim. It's a system built in the late 80s. BGP version 4, the one we still use, was formalized in 1994. And it was designed for an era when the internet was a relatively small community of networks that mostly trusted each other. The people running these networks knew each other. They met at conferences, they had each other's phone numbers, but the internet grew, and that trust model didn't scale. And the consequences of misplaced trust in BGP can be dramatic. Let me give you a famous example. On April 8, 2010, China Telecom, one of the largest ISPs in China, announced BGP routes for roughly 50,000 prefixes that it had no legitimate claim to. For about 18 minutes, a significant chunk of the internet's traffic was being redirected through Chinese networks. Now, whether this was an accident, a misconfiguration that leaked internal routing data, or something more deliberate is still debated. China Telecom said it was an error, but the point is that BGP allowed it to happen. The rest of the internet's routers saw those announcements and, having no way to verify them, accepted them and started forwarding traffic accordingly. An even more vivid example happened on February 24, 2008, when the Pakistani government ordered ISPs to block YouTube within Pakistan. Pakistan Telecom tried to do this by announcing a more specific BGP route for YouTube's IP addresses, basically telling the internet, "I'm the best path to YouTube." But the announcement leaked beyond Pakistan's borders. For about 2 hours, YouTube was effectively unreachable for much of the world because traffic meant for YouTube was being sucked into a black hole in Pakistan Telecom's network. Millions of people couldn't watch videos, and it was all because one ISP made a bad BGP announcement and the rest of the internet trusted it. This is why people who understand BGP sometimes call it the internet's biggest vulnerability. There's been work on fixing this, a system called RPKI, Resource Public Key Infrastructure, which uses cryptographic certificates to verify that an autonomous system is actually authorized to announce a given block of addresses. It's been in development and gradual deployment for years, and adoption has been increasing, especially among larger networks. But it's still not universal. The internet, in a very real sense, still runs on a handshake protocol from the 90s, and it mostly works because most of the people operating these networks are competent and well-intentioned. It's one of those things that, once you know about it, slightly changes how you think about the reliability of everything you do online. Now, BGP is the glue at the network level, but there's another layer of physical infrastructure that's just as important and even less visible to most people, and that's the Internet Exchange Point, or IXP. Think about what happens if two networks in the same city need to exchange traffic. Say your ISP is one network and Netflix runs another, and both have equipment in, say, Los Angeles. Without an exchange point, your request for a Netflix show might have to travel hundreds or thousands of miles to some distant point where those two networks happen to connect and then travel all the way back. That's wasteful, it's slow, and it costs money. An internet exchange point solves this by providing a physical location, usually a data center, where multiple networks can plug in and directly exchange traffic with each other. It's called peering. Two networks agree to exchange traffic directly, usually for free, because it benefits both of them. The biggest IXPs handle staggering amounts of data. DECIX in Frankfurt, Germany, is one of the world's largest. At peak times, it's been measured pushing well over 30 terabits per second of traffic. That's an almost incomprehensible amount of data flowing through a single facility. And there are hundreds of IXPs around the world, in Sao Paulo, in Nairobi, in Mumbai, in Amsterdam, in Ashburn, Virginia. Ashburn, by the way, is worth a brief tangent. This one area in Northern Virginia, not far from Washington, D.C., has become one of the most important internet hubs on Earth. Something like 70% of the world's internet traffic is estimated to pass through Ashburn at some point. It started because MAE East, one of the earliest major internet exchange points in the United States, was located nearby in the early 90s. That attracted ISPs, which attracted data centers, which attracted more networks, which attracted more data centers. A snowball effect. Today, there are over 100 data centers clustered in that region, and the fiber-optic cables connecting them form one of the densest concentrations of bandwidth on the planet. If you've ever streamed a video, sent an email, or loaded a website hosted on AWS, there's a very good chance your data passed through Ashburn. So when you put it all together, the fiber-optic cables we talked about, the submarine systems crossing the oceans, the BGP routing tables, the internet exchange points, you start to see the internet not as some abstract cloud, but as a very real, very physical machine. A machine with geography. A machine that cares about the distance between buildings, the depth of the ocean floor, the political relationships between countries, the business deals between corporations, and a machine that, despite its almost miraculous reliability, is held together in some places by protocols built on trust and infrastructure that's more fragile than most people realize. And speaking of fragility, there's one more piece of this physical story that I think is worth spending a moment on, because it connects to something we'll come back to. Content delivery networks, CDNs. The basic idea is beautifully simple. If you're running a popular website and people all over the world want to access it, you don't want every single request to travel all the way back to your one server in, say, San Francisco. That would be slow for users in Tokyo or Johannesburg, and it would put enormous strain on your server and the networks in between. So instead, you put copies of your content on servers distributed all around the world, as close to users as possible. When someone in Berlin requests your web page, they get it from a server in Frankfurt, not from San Francisco. The latency drops, the experience improves, and the load on the core network decreases. Akamai Technologies, founded in 1998 by Tom Layton and Danny Lewin. Lewin, tragically, was killed aboard American Airlines Flight 11 on September 11, 2001. He was just 31 years old. Akamai was one of the first companies to build this out at scale. The idea actually grew out of a challenge posed by Tim Berners-Lee himself at MIT, who was concerned about web congestion. Layton, a mathematician, and Lewin, his graduate student, developed algorithms for intelligently routing web traffic to the nearest available server. Today, Akamai operates hundreds of thousands of servers in thousands of locations around the world. And they're not alone. Cloudflare, Fastly, Amazon CloudFront, Google's own CDN infrastructure. These networks have become so extensive that for many popular services, the content you're accessing is physically stored in a server room just a few miles from where you're lying right now. And that brings us to something that was quietly transforming the internet throughout the 2000s, something that changed not just how the network operates, but what it even means to run a service on the internet. Because up until roughly the mid-2000s, if you wanted to run a website or an application, you needed your own servers. Physical machines. You bought them, or you rented them from a hosting company, and you managed them. You worried about hardware failures, about capacity planning, about what happens when your traffic spikes and your servers can't keep up. And then, in 2006, a company that most people associated with selling books online quietly launched something that would change everything: Amazon Web Services. Jeff Bezos and his team had noticed something interesting about their own infrastructure. Amazon, the retailer, had built this massive computing platform to handle the traffic spikes of holiday shopping, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, those kinds of events. But most of the year, a huge portion of that computing capacity just sat there, idle. And someone at Amazon, the story usually credits a few people, including Andy Jassy, who would later run the whole company. Someone looked at all those underused servers and asked a very simple question: what if we rented this out? Now, that's a bit of an oversimplification. The real genesis was more deliberate than just renting spare capacity. Amazon had been struggling internally with how slow it was to spin up new projects. Every team that wanted to build something new had to provision their own infrastructure, set up their own databases, their own storage. It was taking months just to get the computing resources in place before anyone could write a line of code. So Amazon started building internal services, standardized modular building blocks that any team could use. Storage as a service, computing as a service, and then the leap. If we've built these services for ourselves, why not offer them to the world? In March 2006, Amazon launched S3, Simple Storage Service. Just storage. You could put files in the cloud and retrieve them, and you paid only for what you used. A few months later, in August 2006, they launched EC2, Elastic Compute Cloud. And this was the big one. EC2 let you rent virtual servers by the hour. You didn't buy hardware. You didn't sign a long-term lease. You just told Amazon how much computing power you needed, and within minutes, you had a server running somewhere in an Amazon data center ready to go. When you were done, you turned it off and stopped paying. Think about what that means. Before EC2, if you were a startup with a new idea, you needed to raise money just to buy servers before you could even test whether your idea worked. You had to guess how much traffic you'd get and buy hardware accordingly. Guess too low, your site crashes on launch day. Guess too high, you've wasted thousands of dollars on machines gathering dust. EC2 eliminated that entire problem. You could start with one small virtual server, and if your app took off overnight, you could scale to 100 servers by morning. If it flopped, you shut everything down, and you were out maybe a few dollars. This is what people mean when they say the cloud, by the way. It's not some ethereal, mystical thing floating in the sky. It's other people's computers. Specifically, it's vast warehouses full of servers, data centers, operated by companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, and you rent slices of those servers over the internet. That's it. That's the cloud. But the simplicity of that description hides just how profoundly it reshaped the internet. Here's the thing. The cloud didn't just make it cheaper to run servers. It changed the entire economics of building internet services. Before the cloud, the barrier to entry was hardware. After the cloud, the barrier to entry was basically just an idea and a credit card, and that unleashed an absolute explosion of new services, new startups, new applications. Instagram, when it launched in 2010, had 13 employees and 30 million users, running entirely on AWS. They didn't own a single server. Netflix, which had been mailing DVDs, migrated its entire streaming operation to AWS starting around 2008. Today, Netflix serves over 200 million subscribers worldwide, and the vast majority of that runs on Amazon's infrastructure. There's something wonderfully ironic about that. One of the world's biggest media companies running on infrastructure owned by one of its biggest competitors. Microsoft saw what was happening and launched Azure in 2010. Google followed with Google Cloud Platform, and these three, AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, still dominate the market today, with AWS holding roughly the largest share. But the point isn't the market dynamics. The point is what this did to the architecture of the internet itself. Because here's where it gets really interesting from a networking perspective. The rise of cloud computing meant that internet traffic patterns fundamentally changed. In the early internet, traffic was relatively distributed. Lots of small servers, lots of different locations. By the 2010s, an enormous and growing share of internet traffic was flowing to and from a relatively small number of hyperscale data centers. Amazon, Microsoft, and Google started building their own private backbone networks, fiber-optic cables spanning continents, connecting their data centers to each other and to major internet exchange points. Google, for instance, operates one of the largest private networks in the world. When you send a search query, it might travel over the public internet only for the very first and last hop. The rest of the journey happens entirely on Google's own fiber, their own routers, their own infrastructure. These companies became, in effect, their own little internets within the internet. And this concentration had consequences. Remember how we talked about BGP and how the internet is this decentralized mesh of autonomous systems all peering with each other? That's still technically true. But in practice, the internet has become much more centralized than its original designers ever imagined. A 2019 study found that a huge percentage of web traffic goes to just a handful of companies. When AWS has an outage, and it does happen, like the major US East 1 region outage in December 2021, it doesn't just take down Amazon. It takes down thousands of websites and services that most people don't even realize are running on Amazon's servers. Robot vacuums stop working. Dating apps go offline. News sites go dark. The internet doesn't break exactly, but big chunks of the experience most people associate with the internet just vanish for a few hours. So that's one of the great tensions of the modern internet. The protocols, TCP/IP, BGP, DNS, they were designed for a decentralized, resilient network where no single point of failure could bring everything down. And at the protocol level, that's still true. The internet's routing will happily work around a failed link or a dead router. But at the application level, at the level of the services people actually use every day, there's been this massive consolidation. And that's not really a networking problem. It's an economic one. It's cheaper and easier to run on AWS than to build your own infrastructure. So everyone does it. And that creates a kind of fragility that Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn probably never anticipated. Now let's shift gears a little, because there's another transformation that was happening in parallel with the rise of cloud computing, and it's one you're participating in right now if you're listening to this on a phone: the mobile internet. And the story of how the internet went from something you accessed sitting at a desk to something that lives in your pocket. That's a story about radio waves, about cellular networks, and about a remarkable convergence of technologies that all matured at roughly the same time. The first generation of cellular networks, 1G, launched in the early 1980s, was purely analog voice. You could make phone calls, and that was it. 2G, which arrived in the early 90s with the GSM standard in Europe and CDMA in the United States, went digital, and it introduced something that seems almost quaint now: text messaging. SMS, short message service. But 2G data speeds were painfully slow. We're talking about 9.6 kilobits per second initially. You could load a very simple web page maybe if you were patient. The real shift started with 3G, which rolled out in the early 2000s. 3G was designed from the ground up to carry data, not just voice. Speeds jumped to hundreds of kilobits per second, eventually a few megabits. And that was enough, just barely enough, to make a mobile web browser actually usable. But here's what's fascinating. The mobile internet existed before the iPhone. There were smartphones before 2007, BlackBerry, Palm, Nokia's Symbian devices. You could browse the web on them, sort of. There was even a stripped-down version of the web called WAP, Wireless Application Protocol, that tried to create mobile-friendly content. But it was clunky, limited, and nobody really loved it. What Steve Jobs did when he unveiled the iPhone in January 2007 wasn't inventing the mobile internet. What he did was make it feel like the real internet. The iPhone's Safari browser rendered actual web pages, full web pages, on a touchscreen you could pinch and zoom, and that changed people's expectations overnight. Suddenly, the internet on your phone didn't mean some stripped-down, text-heavy approximation. It meant the actual internet. And once people expected that, the demand for mobile bandwidth exploded. 4G LTE, which started rolling out around 2009 and 2010, delivered speeds that rivaled home broadband, tens of megabits per second, sometimes over 100, and that made streaming video on your phone not just possible, but normal. YouTube, Netflix, TikTok. These services are essentially unthinkable without 4G. And now we're in the era of 5G, which promises even higher speeds and, crucially, much lower latency. But here's what I want you to think about, because it connects back to everything we've talked about. When you open an app on your phone and stream a video, the data's journey is astonishing. The video file is probably stored on a CDN server in a data center not far from you, maybe one of those Akamai or CloudFront edge servers we talked about. Your request travels as a radio signal from your phone to the nearest cell tower, gets converted to an electrical or optical signal, travels through your carrier's network to an internet exchange point, gets routed via BGP to the CDN's autonomous system, reaches the server, and then the video data makes the reverse trip, all in milliseconds. Every single layer we've talked about, the fiber optics, the routing protocols, the DNS lookups, the TCP connections, the CDN caching, the cloud infrastructure, all of it is involved in that one simple act of watching a video on your phone in bed. And it all happens so fast and so seamlessly that you never think about it, which, honestly, might be the greatest engineering achievement of all. Not any one of these systems individually, but the fact that they all work together, invisibly, billions of times a day. And that seamlessness, that invisibility, it creates an interesting paradox. Because the more reliable and effortless the internet becomes, the less people understand about what's actually happening underneath. And that matters, because the internet isn't just a technical system anymore. It's the infrastructure of modern civilization, banking, healthcare, elections, military communications, power grids. All of it runs on or depends on the internet now. And the decisions being made about how the internet works, who controls it, who gets access, how traffic is prioritized, those are some of the most consequential decisions of our time. Which brings us to something that's been simmering in the background of this whole story. Something that gets to the very heart of what the internet is and who it belongs to. Because there's been a long, contentious, and still unresolved debate about a principle called net neutrality. And to understand why it matters so much, you need to understand something about how internet service providers, the companies that sell you your home broadband or your mobile data plan, how they actually fit into the picture. Because ISPs occupy a unique position in the internet's architecture. They're the gatekeepers. They own or lease the last mile, that final stretch of cable or wireless signal that connects your home, your phone, your laptop to the rest of the network. And without them, you don't get on the internet at all. It's that simple. You can have the most brilliant web application running on the most sophisticated cloud infrastructure, cached on CDN servers in every major city on Earth. But if the ISP that serves your neighborhood decides to slow down your connection to that service, or block it entirely, or charge you extra to access it, well then, all that engineering elegance doesn't matter much to you, does it? And that's essentially what the net neutrality debate is about. The principle itself is straightforward. All internet traffic should be treated equally. Your ISP shouldn't be allowed to speed up traffic from one website and slow down traffic from another. They shouldn't be able to charge certain companies for faster access to their customers. They shouldn't be able to block services that compete with their own products. The internet, under net neutrality, is like a utility, a dumb pipe, in the best sense of that phrase. Data goes in one end, data comes out the other, and the pipe doesn't care what the data is or where it's going. The term itself was coined by a Columbia law professor named Tim Wu in a 2003 paper. But the idea goes back much further than that. It's really just a modern version of a concept called common carriage, which has been around for centuries. The basic notion is that if you operate essential infrastructure that the public depends on, a railroad, a telephone network, a shipping line, you have an obligation to serve everyone on equal terms. You can't refuse to carry someone's goods because you don't like them, or charge them more because they're competing with a business you also own. Common carriage was a foundational principle of telecommunications law for most of the 20th century, and it's part of the reason the telephone network worked the way it did. AT&T couldn't listen to your phone call and decide to degrade the quality because you were calling a competitor's customer service line. But when the internet came along, things got murky. The question was, are ISPs more like telephone companies, which were classified as common carriers under Title II of the Communications Act? Or are they more like information services, which had much lighter regulation under Title I? And this classification question, which sounds incredibly dry and bureaucratic, turned out to be one of the most consequential regulatory battles of the early 21st century. Here's why it mattered so much. In the early days, when most people got online through dial-up modems over their phone lines, the common carrier rules applied by default. Your phone company couldn't discriminate against your internet traffic because it was traveling over the phone network, which was already regulated. But as broadband took over, cable internet, DSL, and later fiber, the FCC, under Chairman Michael Powell, classified cable internet as an information service in 2002, effectively removing it from common carrier obligations. The Supreme Court upheld this in the Brand X case in 2005, and suddenly, ISPs had a lot more freedom to do whatever they wanted with the traffic flowing through their networks. Now, you might think, okay, but would they actually abuse that freedom? And the answer is yes, they did, almost immediately. In 2007, Comcast was caught secretly throttling BitTorrent traffic, slowing down peer-to-peer file sharing for its customers without telling them. The FCC ordered Comcast to stop, but Comcast sued, and in 2010, a federal court ruled that the FCC didn't actually have the authority to enforce net neutrality under the existing regulatory framework. This kicked off a decade-long regulatory ping-pong match. The FCC, under Chairman Tom Wheeler, passed strong net neutrality rules in 2015 by reclassifying broadband as a Title II common carrier service. Then, the FCC, under Chairman Ajit Pai, reversed those rules in 2017, reclassifying broadband back to Title I. And the debate has continued since, with various states passing their own net neutrality laws, court challenges flying back and forth, and the FCC attempting another reclassification in 2024. But here's the thing that makes this more than just a regulatory squabble. The reason net neutrality matters so deeply is that it gets at something fundamental about the Internet's design philosophy, the end-to-end principle that Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn baked into TCP/IP from the very beginning. Remember, the genius of the Internet's architecture is that the network itself is simple. It just moves packets. All the intelligence, all the innovation happens at the edges, in the applications, the services, the devices. That's what allowed the web to be invented without asking permission from the network operators. That's what allowed email and streaming video and social media and every other application to emerge. Nobody had to get approval from AT&T or Comcast to build something new on top of the Internet. You just built it, and if it worked, people used it. Net neutrality is what preserves that openness. Without it, ISPs become not just pipes, but gatekeepers with the power to pick winners and losers. And the concern isn't hypothetical. In markets where net neutrality protections are weak, you've seen ISPs bundle internet access the way cable TV used to be bundled. Pay extra for a social media package, pay extra for streaming, pay extra for gaming. You've seen ISPs zero-rate their own services, meaning traffic to their own streaming platform doesn't count against your data cap, but traffic to Netflix does. These practices tilt the playing field. They make it harder for the next small startup to compete against an established giant that can afford to pay for preferential treatment. And this connects to a broader theme that's been running through this whole story, if you think about it. The Internet succeeded precisely because it was open and decentralized. Packet switching worked because it didn't require central control. TCP/IP won because it was a universal language that anyone could speak. The web exploded because Tim Berners-Lee gave it away for free. At every critical juncture, the decisions that made the Internet what it is were decisions that favored openness over control, interoperability over proprietary lock-in, innovation at the edges over power at the center. Net neutrality is just the latest chapter in that ongoing tension. But it's not the only tension. Because while we're debating who controls the pipes, there's an equally profound question about who controls the platforms that sit on top of those pipes. And this is where the story of the Internet gets really interesting, and honestly, a little unsettling, because the Internet that exists today looks very different from the one that the early pioneers imagined. Think about it this way. The original vision Licklider's intergalactic computer network, the ARPANET's distributed architecture, Berners-Lee's web of freely linked documents, all of that imagined a decentralized system where no single entity had too much power. And for a while, that's more or less what we had. The early web was a wild, messy, beautiful collection of personal homepages and small forums and independent websites. But over time, network effects and economies of scale concentrated an enormous amount of the Internet's activity into a handful of platforms. Google handles something like 90% of web searches globally. Meta's platforms, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, connect billions of people. Amazon dominates e-commerce and, as we talked about, cloud infrastructure. A huge percentage of the Internet's traffic goes to or through just a few companies, and those companies have built something that the original Internet architects never quite anticipated: application layer gatekeepers. The network layer is still technically open. Anyone can still put up a website. Anyone can still send a packet. But in practice, if your content doesn't show up in Google's search results, or if your app gets removed from Apple's App Store, or if your business can't advertise on Meta's platforms, you might as well not exist for most people. The gatekeeping has moved up the stack, from the physical network to the software layer. This is a fascinating inversion of the Internet's original promise, and it's one that engineers and policymakers and ordinary people are all still grappling with. How do you preserve the openness and innovation that made the Internet great while dealing with the very real problems that come with platforms of this scale? Misinformation, privacy violations, market concentration, the algorithmic amplification of harmful content. These aren't purely technical questions. They're social, political, economic, and ethical questions. But they're built on a technical foundation. And understanding that foundation, understanding how packets move, how routing works, how DNS translates names to numbers, how CDNs cache content, how cloud infrastructure centralizes computing, all of that helps you think more clearly about the choices we face. And there's one more thing worth thinking about as you lie there, maybe starting to drift off a little. The Internet is not finished. It's not a completed project. It's still being built, still being argued about, still being reinvented. The transition to IPv6, the next generation of Internet addresses, is still ongoing, decades after it was first proposed, because the original IPv4 address space of about 4.3 billion addresses has long since been exhausted. The deployment of encrypted DNS protocols like DNS over HTTPS is changing how name resolution works and raising new questions about privacy and censorship. The rise of satellite internet, constellations like Starlink, is promising to bring connectivity to remote areas that fiber and cell towers can't easily reach, which could change the geography of internet access in profound ways. And artificial intelligence is beginning to reshape how content is created, discovered, and consumed online, which will have implications for every layer of the stack. But here's what I keep coming back to, and it's the thing that I find most remarkable about this whole story. The Internet, this thing that connects half the world's population, that carries the bulk of human commerce and communication, that has reshaped politics and culture, and science and entertainment. It wasn't built by any one person, any one company, or any one government. It was built by thousands of people, over decades, making incremental contributions. Paul Baran sketching out distributed networks at Rand. Donald Davies independently inventing packet switching in London. Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn hammering out TCP/IP. Louis Pouzin building cyclades in France and proving that datagrams could work. John Postel, quietly managing the internet's address space from his office at USC. Tim Berners-Lee writing his proposal that his boss marked vague but exciting. Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina coding Mosaic in a basement in Illinois. Charles Cow theorizing that glass could carry light. The unnamed technicians who spliced fiber-optic cables on the ocean floor. The engineers at Akamai figuring out how to serve content from the edge. The teams at Amazon who accidentally invented cloud computing by modularizing their own infrastructure. Every one of those contributions built on what came before. Every one of them depended on open standards and shared knowledge and the willingness of people to publish their ideas rather than hoard them. The internet is, in a very real sense, the largest collaborative engineering project in human history. And it works. Not perfectly. It's messy and fragile in places, and over-centralized in others, and vulnerable to all sorts of attacks and failures. But it works. Billions of times a day, a packet leaves someone's device, traverses a web of fiber and copper and radio waves, gets routed through autonomous systems by BGP, resolved by DNS, accelerated by CDNs, processed in cloud data centers, and arrives at its destination, usually in less time than it takes you to blink. And right now, as you're lying there listening to this, that whole system is humming along beneath you, around you, through you. Signals are bouncing off cell towers and racing through fiber-optic cables under the ocean and being routed through internet exchange points in Frankfurt and Ashburn and São Paulo and Tokyo. Somewhere, a DNS resolver is answering a query. Somewhere, a BGP router is updating its routing table. Somewhere, a submarine cable repair ship is heading out to fix a break caused by a fishing trawler or an earthquake. The internet never stops. It just keeps carrying packets, billions and billions of them, all day, all night, right now, even as your eyes get heavy and your thoughts start to soften and blur. It's a good thing to fall asleep knowing, I think, that underneath all the noise and the arguments and the complexity, there's this extraordinary machine that people built together, piece by piece, layer by layer, over half a century, and it connects us. For all its flaws, for all the debates about who controls it and how it should work, it connects us. And that's not a small thing. So let that thought settle in. Let it be the last thing you hold on to as you drift off. The internet is there, humming quietly in the background, carrying the world's conversations and questions and stories through the dark, and it'll still be there in the morning. Sleep well.